Welcome to the Six Conditions podcast, where we explore the science and art of great teams. Join show hosts Drs. Ruth Wagaman and Krister Lowe for pithy summaries of great research being done on teams and organizations, as well as inspired and artful approaches for using those ideas to enable brilliant collaborations. Let's get today's conversation started.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Six Conditions podcast, where we're exploring the science and art of great teams. Today, we have a special guest joining us on the show, Dr. David Tate. David, welcome to the Six Conditions podcast. How are you today?
Great, Krister. Thanks. Great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. So, David, we oftentimes start off these show episodes with just a little bit of banter. And so I'm going to invite Ruth to share a little bit of what's on her mind about teams, and I'll do the same, and then we'll give a more formal introduction to you. So, Ruth, what's percolating in your mind these days about this work with teams and the science and art of great teams?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm going to say will not come as a surprise to you, which is I am fascinated and inspired by the uprising of protests against racial violence and in favor of social justice, and it started thinking me a lot about how Six Conditions thinking and the ability to build great teams right from the start can contribute to an effective social movement. I used to work with Marshall Gans, and in our work together, we would think about a social movement or community organizing really is about building a structure. He used to call it a snowflake structure, interconnected teams of teams. Would love to bring more of that thinking to more organizers. I know you and I are going to be doing some teaching to an ongoing workshop class of organizers next week, Krister. So I'm looking forward to that. But the notion that we can create whole systems that are enacting social change by starting with the individual and helping them form a team and helping teams form this larger team of teams. I think that's a really critical skill for us tackling some of the big problems that we are facing. So that's what's on my mind.
Love that.
How about you, Krister? What do you reflect on?
Yeah, well, just kind of riffing off that, it kind of brings me back about a year or two ago. Deloitte did this study of what they call the rise of the social enterprise, where generations, especially the younger generations, are looking more and more to enterprise to fill gaps around leadership in the world and to move beyond just profit as, an ROI as the metric, but more how are we impacting society and the world, right? And so now fast forward to COVID has, really, the environment and the context that we're living in is now front and center. We're all challenged on this public health level. It's bringing to the surface inequities, and we even go back a year ago to the Me Too movement. So the environment of an interconnected world of 8 billion people is forcing itself front and center onto the agenda. And, that to me is, terrifying on the one hand, but also inspiring that we could really deploy teams to work on really the challenges of our time that are much more than just helping companies be profitable, which I think are important, right? So I'm a believer in, building a peaceful and prosperous world for all. But I do feel like there's some challenges now, and there's nothing like an urgent challenge to mobilize teams to do something that they wouldn't do otherwise, right? So I guess I'm taking a little bit of heart around that, and obviously tempered the enthusiasm with just the risk and the danger that we're in. But I do expect us to really step it up as a species, but also in our profession. The other one is, I think this time is really just challenging my assumptions about what's possible virtually. Ruth, you and I have been doing as part of our pro bono program, working with a COVID-19 team where we only get them for 45 minutes a week. But in 6 weeks, 45 minutes a week, we've been able to really work with that team and go so far. And I think it's really challenged a lot of assumptions about how we approach this work, what's possible in a virtual environment, what's possible in even short time frames where you don't have the luxury to do half day or 1 day or 2 day launches and interview.
Yeah, you don't need a whole day face to face in order to build momentum.
So anyways, that's what's on my mind. I think this is a good segue into this interview, and want to give you a warm welcome onto the show, David. We wanted to invite you. We've known of you and your work for some time, and you've been involved in the last year or so in the Six Conditions community, and you have a great case example working with 13 teams in a private equity setting. I had was fortunate to get to be part of your team to do some work on that, and Ruth was invited to to consult around some of the data analysis across all the teams. But I thought you'd be a great person to have on the show for that. And you just bring a lot of great perspectives. But let's just give a formal introduction to David, a brief one though here. And David, I'll ask you to round out anything else you'd like to share about yourself at the end. But we have joining us today, Dr. David Tate. He's a licensed clinical psychologist, professionally certified coach, and an organizational consultant. He's an assistant clinical professor in psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine and a lecturer at the Yale School of Management, where he's teaching both graduate and executive education programs. He conducts leadership development activities with the Yale Greenberg World Fellows Program and Yale's Jackson's Institute of Global Affairs. He has his own boutique consultancy, the Tate Consulting Group, consulting to organizations, has some background in family-owned enterprises, among others. He's the co-author of the book Sink or Swim, How Lessons from the Titanic Can Save Your Family Business. He has a forthcoming book on the conscious accountability, deepen connections, elevate results. And maybe David can speak about that, which is really about how awareness can create virtuous cycles of learning that lead to improvements in task performance and relationships. So there's a lot more here. David's really just has a rich background and a lot of education and experience out there. And I learned something new about David today, is that he was a gymnast, competitive gymnast from junior high all the way through college and afterwards. So, brings a little bit of an athletic perspective to that.
And a good sense of balance.
And a good sense of
balance. That's it. Try it.
So David, that's a little warm up for you, but what else would you like the audience to know a bit about yourself before we get started here?
I mean, Krister, thank you for that really lovely introduction. And I guess I feel very fortunate to be able to think about the work we do with teams and with systems, from I guess a number of different points of view. Being involved both in consultation and working directly with leaders and teams. When I started, as you mentioned, when I started my consulting practice, I worked primarily with family-owned enterprises, and that's obviously from a team's perspective has brought a lot of richness in terms of the dynamics that occur in family teams and family enterprises. Over time, my work has kind of morphed more broadly into leadership development, not just in those kinds of organizations, but other kinds of organizations as well. And so these days, leadership development can look like working with individuals in executive coaching, can working with cohorts of people inside of organizations or specific teams. And so the other thing that I've been up to is, teaching at Yale about half-time and, getting to really think about helping, the future generations of leaders develop. At Yale, we are focused on, our mission is really educating leaders for business and society. So I really was resonating with the comments that you and Ruth were making earlier, about the potential for our work to address some of the kind of challenging, kind of wicked problems of the world, which there are many to name. So I mean, that's really something I'm passionate about, is really supporting the development of global leaders who are not there just to make a profit, but to make a difference in so many of the challenges that we see. So I'm feeling very much in alignment with both of you in terms of some of the things you're thinking about.
That's awesome. So David, let's fast forward a little bit. I know you got certified and trained in the 6 conditions a while back. You did our level 1 and our level 2 program, but I'm curious, what brought you to the 6 conditions? I think you're trained in multiple team effectiveness frameworks and approaches and assessments and such, but what brought you to the 6 conditions? And then, we'll kind of go from there, because I think you got really quick into a really interesting, juicy case with 13 teams. And, but maybe we could just start with, how you came to the framework and what brought you to that.
Sure. So I've been aware of the 6 conditions framework, for a while, as someone who likes to, think about my work, bringing in well-validated instruments that's supported by research. So I've been aware of the 6 conditions framework and this sort of the lengthy history of work that's supported that. But as I got to understand the framework better, one of the things that it did was really help me view my work with teams in a different way. So, as I mentioned, I started off working with family businesses, and in those contexts, I often got called in to work with where there were active conflicts happening, either with family members or between family members and non-family members, or between owners and non-owners. So there was sort of any number of different kinds of conflicts that I might get called into to manage. And having a background, as a clinician, and being attuned to sort of interpersonal dynamics and communication, that's where I often tended to look first when I was getting asked to be pulled into these systems, and there were certainly lots of things you could look at that appeared to be the issue, in terms of how people managed themselves or dealt with their emotions. I mean, it was easy to get pulled into looking at the system through that lens. But what the 6 conditions really helped shift my thinking, and it reminds me of the quote by Abraham Maslow, which is if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So I think I was a little, stuck in that kind of thinking a bit. And the 6 conditions framework helped me really think about looking upstream and looking at really the contextual factors and the design elements of teams in a different way, which actually at first I have to acknowledge was like, wait, what do you mean? Is this going to make me irrelevant, in terms of the kind of work that I did? But I quickly came to see that actually no, it was very empowering, actually, an empowering message that we can really think differently about team design and can have a profound effect on how teams function and the dynamics that we see by attending to these conditions. So that was really an eye opener. And then I had the opportunity to work on this case, which we'll get into in a moment. And that was another sort of thing that accelerated my involvement with the 6 conditions framework and with the TDS. So shall we begin to? Shall I tell you a little bit about how that got going, or is there anything else you want to hear?
Yeah, I just want to comment and hear what Ruth has to say. But this comment of like, when you learn the 6 conditions, it can rattle your confidence around what you've been using up to that date. You're not the only one who has mentioned that, because you start to feel like, oh wow, have I been out there selling something that really doesn't work? And I think you said it well. It's not that what you were doing or what we do oftentimes with other interventions or levels of analysis aren't useful. It's just, if we actually look at the context within which those are happening, the 6 conditions really helps us really get the contextual drivers and determinants in place that can illuminate that work even more, or give that work some legs. And, that was my frustration with doing conflict resolution in organizations for over a decade, was I felt like it was alleviating pressure, but it wasn't really addressing what was driving that in the first place, which was oftentimes structural in origin. And, I've spoken about that before. So I just wanted to comment on that, because that resonates with me. And you're not the only one that has felt challenged by some of our, the propositions or the principles of really the importance of structural determinants of behavior, drivers of human behavior and dynamics in groups.
I think sometimes when we encounter something that's really profound and is sort of a paradigm shifter, we have resistance around it, or we have that moment where we're like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, I have to really restructure kind of the way I think about things. And in the long run, that's a wonderful thing. I think there's lots of that happening in society right now. People kind of having to rethink about systemic factors and contextual factors in a different way. And that's
actually,
not a bad thing.
And actually see the system in the context for the first time, not just be the fish in water who are not aware of the water. Yeah,
exactly.
That is a powerful thing. I was curious, as I was listening to you talk about the history of your work, about your reflections about using the 6 conditions framework to understand what's going on in family-owned businesses, because there are many groups involved in a family-owned business, and I think some of them in a pretty straightforward way you can think of as a team, like the leadership team of an enterprise. It's a team. And there are operational teams throughout them, but then when you get to the sort of advisory boards or the family councils or the family themselves or a generation, that doesn't immediately look to me like a real team in the way that we define it, but it could. I just wondered if you've reflected at all on whether the 6 conditions framework is helpful in thinking about some of the drivers of what goes on, for better or for worse, in those kinds of bodies in a family-owned enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these kind of groups of people often refer to themselves as teams. Or sometimes they'll talk about, okay, the family team or the advisory team. And I think what the 6 conditions framework does is really help better elucidate, what does it really mean to be a team? And, and for a team to function well, like, what does that actually mean in terms of, a number of things? So I think, it's definitely helped me be able to, work with different constituents within family enterprise and help them see in clearer terms what being a team really means. Advisors often talk about working together as a team, and in more instances than not, that's not that they work rather separately. And don't necessarily have an identity as a team per se. Right. But when they do, if they can make that shift, they can have a much stronger impact on how they can influence, a family firm for the better.
So when you think about helping them to recognize what are the handful of things, if they did them together and in alignment, would allow them to serve their function for the firm that much more effectively. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Nice. Well, let's pivot into this multi-team case, which is, I think, a really rich one. And, like many cases, I think there's a lot of catalytic work that happened over a good 4 or 5 months around getting these 13 teams in this private equity portfolio, different companies, but the top teams. But I think it's seeded some ongoing work as well, right? So the story's not over, but maybe we'll capture at least the front end piece of this rich case. But David, why don't you share a little bit about this rich case study? I think there's some good insight and lessons to learn from it.
Yeah, sure. So this private equity firm had been a client for some time, and they came to me and said, we would really like to do some kind of an educational undertaking, really for all of our companies, and we'd like to focus on team high performance and what are the drivers of team high performance. And the idea was that they wanted to kind of allow each company to reflect individually on its leadership team, on each leadership team, and then also to see what could be learned when they looked across how all of the different teams, within the firm were doing, and what could they learn. So it was really kind of a developmental, kind of educational effort. It was not meant to be evaluative, but just really something that to add value to have, because they really appreciated that how teams function particularly at the senior leadership team level was really crucial in terms of how they perform and kind of the value that they can generate over time. So, in thinking about how, what we would do, the 6 conditions framework came to mind right away. First, because again, it's so well supported by research, and this particular firm really, had an orientation towards sort of data-driven approaches. So from that perspective, I thought it would resonate well. And also, it was focused on, again, it's as we've been talking, it's not focused on team dynamics per se or team process. It's really more about team design. And I think that's a question that this firm was really interested in understanding, is because when they make acquisitions, part of, what they do is really think carefully about how can they help round out these teams to set them up for success.
Which is in your interest, obviously.
Yeah.
And these are like
yes, but still, there are plenty of investors that aren't thinking in those developmental terms. So sorry to interrupt you, Krista.
No, I was just saying the size companies like $100 million to $1 billion companies, they're considered smaller, medium cap, I guess, right? Small cap companies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So with that, I quickly hustled and got myself through level 2 certification, and then
just in time learning,
and then of course we needed to also pull together a team to work with this many companies. As you mentioned, I have a sort of a smaller consultancy. I normally work with one or two other colleagues closely on various projects, but for this project, we actually needed a slightly bigger team to be able to move through, get 13 companies through an assessment and debrief process in within just a couple of months. So that was a challenge, but challenge accepted. And was so grateful when you came on board, Krista, and Ruth, you as well, kind of supporting what we could do here. And that was part of the learning journey for us. I think was how do we kind of quickly form a team and work together effectively to create a good outcome and a positive experience for the client. And all of the companies that were a part of this.
Yeah. So there were 4 of us kind of doing the main lifting, and then Ruth was a 5th in terms of like a data advisor and just generally providing some great support. But then I think it's also interesting to think about team, because we also work very closely with some of the members of the private equity company, right? Who were the liaisons for the various companies in the portfolio. So if you kind of look at it, it's there is this interesting set of relationships here about enabling an intervention like this that went beyond just the 4 and 5 of us and the teams, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what the big challenges were as you reflect back on this.
Great question, Ruth. I think one of them was kind of the process of, different CEOs and different companies kind of being in different places with regard to this kind of a project.
Right.
The full gamut of people who were actually had used the TDS previously in their companies and were very familiar with the instrument and had, and were kind of fully enrolled in the idea of, at paying attention to team development and team design as being a really crucial part of what leaders should be up to. From other people who, to the other side of it, who were, more interested in like, let me get back to work kind of a thing,
yeah.
or, like
they weren't on board.
less so. And in addition, there was also, because each company was supported by different people within the firm, some people within the firm explained the project, differently to different people. Some were explained it, elaborately with all of the right details. And other times we would get on a call with the CEO thinking they had already been pretty debriefed on what to expect and saying, don't really know what this is about at all. Tell me about it. So we're really starting from scratch. So again, the process of getting going and getting kind of buy-in from the CEOs and the teams was a little different across the teams.
And safety around how the data was going to be used. So I think we really were trying to establish a sense that this isn't being used to evaluate your effectiveness. It's more, it's a developmental objective, but just saying that is not enough, right? People have to really believe that. And so I think that was part of the rapport building and the onboarding process to really help them see that it wasn't like we were, stealth mode trying to really evaluate their effectiveness as teams, right? In the sense of that it would lead to other ramifications around investment or not, right?
Right. Yeah, and that was another thing that became evident, right? Like that each of these teams had sort of different kind of, relationships with the firm. And that's, again, makes perfect sense, right? This is, this is not cookie cutter kind of stuff. But that became part of the, the dynamics that we were encountering and working with as we interfaced with them through the process.
David, could you capture like the main elements of the arc? So this wasn't full blown like 6-month or 12-month engagements with each of the teams. This was more like the front end piece of doing some discovery and assessment and debriefing. And then you also had all the leaders coming together. Could you talk a little bit about just like the boundaries of this engagement?
Sure. So really, the goal of this was for each team to go through an assessment process and to get some feedback, and then for us to be able to kind of, in addition to working with each team, helping them understand the data and and how they might use it for their own development. We then kind of were able to look at the data as a sort of as a data set and look, aggregate when we aggregated it across the 13 teams to look at kind of what patterns we noticed, and then feed those patterns back to all of the CEOs and to the firm. So
which you did in person, right? Where they brought everybody together for an event where you had them for a few hours to go over it all together as a cohort, right?
That's right. So they had an event, and at that event, this was part of it, a presentation on kind of what we found. So the process, specifically entailed, kind of getting a little bit of background from the firm on each company before we met with the CEO, meeting with the CEO to kind of, build some rapport, learn about their perspective on the team, and what the strengths and what the challenges are, as well as their own leadership from their point of view, as in their role as team leaders. And then we deployed both the TDS and an instrument called the Neethling Brain Instrument, which is about thinking styles, which is an individual assessment, but also can be deployed and looked at as a kind of a team composite. So it gives them both individual information, but also gives another lens through which to look at the collective sort of thinking styles of the team. And
can I interrupt real quick? So, and just to mention, this was all done virtually, except you're meeting with all the CEOs in person at the end of the process. And one other thing to slip in is that the private equity company, Top Team, also did this on themselves. So it wasn't just the companies in the portfolio, right? They wanted to model good behavior themselves, right? Or that they were open to this developmental process on themselves. We felt like that was a critical part of the process, right? And they were totally on board with that from the beginning. So that's right. So, right, it was all done virtually, and again, you talked earlier about like expanding, your mindset about what can be done and accomplished on a virtual basis. I mean, I think this was one of those projects that definitely expanded my, thinking in terms of, what was possible, and so that's the other challenge, Ruth. You mentioned about challenges earlier. It was at times a little bit like herding cats to get everybody, each of these teams, each of the members through the assessment so that it could be, so we could have complete data. So that was definitely a challenge, but we, managed to, with persistence, managed to make it happen, which I'm pleased to be able to report. So that was, so we got the teams through all of it, and
we had some interesting, I think some interesting results, some interesting findings as well.
Do you want to give us the highlights of what the patterns were and what the private equity firm valued about seeing those data, and also what the teams themselves valued about it? Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so first of all, I mean, one of the things that came back is that overall, this group was looking pretty good as a group. They looked pretty, that their effectiveness was pretty strong, and that for many of them, a lot of the conditions were looking in pretty good shape. And so, we thought about, well, why would that be? Why might that be? Compared to, other, leadership teams, why would this group be looking better than most?
Right. This is like top quartile, right? Because your research on senior leadership teams, Ruth, found that it was like 20 or 25% max were
exactly.
in the top
the vast
quartile.
Majority of them are poor or struggling. Yes, leadership teams.
Yeah. So this is like a group that looked like it was in that top quartile. And, a couple of things came to mind. First, these teams were being selected in part because they're strong performers to begin with. So, in some ways, because these companies were found to be like, kind of worthy of investment, that they were probably doing okay, to begin with. And then, as I mentioned previously, the firm really took care to be thinking about how could they round out these teams? How can they recruit additional talent to really help these teams go to the next level, or to kind of fill any gaps that might be there. So in addition, into the whatever selection effects, there's also this this sort of intentionality on the part of the firm to really attend to the development of these teams.
So I add one other point. I think maybe you've said it, but I think when private equity firms are investing, they do their due diligence, so they're not investing
They're
in
not picking
wild card
really dysfunctional teams, right? Yeah.
So I think there may be a little bit of a selection effect as well. In addition to, I'm struck that most teams don't get this level of support when they're being formed or supported, right? And there was a hands-on level of supporting these teams around composition and strategy and other things. So I think, both on the selection side, but also when they were being designed and relaunched, there was a fair amount of support. And I think that, goes a long way to talk about the setup of teams, right? Which is one of the big things we're proponents of. So.
Right. But we did find, that there were a couple of places where there could be some, potential improvements made, or some, if they were to sort of give some attention and focus, they could probably get even more lift from some of their teams. It appeared that they could probably figure out how to work even more interdependently. That was sort of one of the things that we noticed, is it seemed that a lot of times the way these teams are functioning was that they had a lot of really strong individual executives who were working well in their own silos, but not necessarily getting the full juice out of the orange in terms of what the capacity of them working together, for that compelling purpose. So that was one thing we saw some room for in terms of where improvements could happen. Going from great to greater. I mean, there's always room for improvement. And the other one that we noticed was when it came to the team's purpose, there was this pattern where folks consistently rated the challenge aspect a bit lower. So they, and again, it wasn't that they didn't feel challenged as individuals, but that the team's purpose wasn't necessarily one that they experienced as challenging.
Yeah.
The collective, they weren't being challenged.
That's usually two related areas, right? The interdependence and the low challenge. It often is because when they convene, They're just sharing updates of what's gone on in their individual areas. They're not doing collective leadership of the firm.
Right. Exactly. So, so you're right. So those two things kind of hang together really nicely. And another finding that supports that was that for many of these teams, they weren't necessarily leveraging the full knowledge and skill of the individual members for the team's work. So again, that suggests that again, there's more that was available there if they could kind of create some more challenge around their purpose and work more interdependently.
Wasn't there something there related to that too, David, around team coaching?
Yes.
I think many of the CEOs got really interested in that, which I found in other companies as well. Is most leaders have not been groomed or grown up with the idea of coaching the team as a whole. They tend to lead through the one-on-one management style, which only fosters good connections between them and each member, but not between the members or the team as a whole. And all those threads almost seem to come together around interdependence, challenges a team, not utilizing the talent and the coaching they get. That's all for me kind of a gestalt.
A nice story. Yep.
Yeah, it's a story.
Yeah, that's right. And that was, of all of the enabling conditions, it was team coaching that was rated the lowest.
Not terrible, but lower. Yeah.
Yeah. Not relatively speaking, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't terrible, but again, the idea was that, and often that it was helpful when it was there, but it wasn't there as much as they'd like. And so, I think there was this invitation, in a more conscious way for team leaders to think of themselves more as team coaching is an important part of what they do, in terms of working with their teams. So really, really trying to enable their development over time. So yeah, I think there was, it ended up telling kind of a nice story. And, I remember when they, commissioned me to do this work, that was really what they were hoping for. They said, hopefully, the data will tell a story. And if it doesn't, make one up.
Fortunately, there was a story.
Yes.
But, it's interesting that these are 13 very different companies, but that you saw a common pattern across them, I think is really interesting, right? And it just lends itself to the database we have about what do we know about leadership teams and some of the common challenges. But there's this thing just around being more than just a group of individuals, right? And what needs collaborative work or what is the interdependent work of a leadership team is unlike a task performing team where it's very clear what they're supposed to be delivering. I think leadership teams' purposes tend to be a little bit harder to pin down. And it's natural that in the absence of getting a lot of clarity around that, teams will just kind of, devolve to the least amount of interdependent work that they should do together, which is coming together for updates, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
It also strikes me as really interesting feedback and some significant validation for the private equity firm of what they were doing to support these teams. Because one of the most common tripwires of startups is you choose people to work with you that you dig working with, and they're often a lot of your friends, and they're not really rounding out the full set of capabilities that are needed to get that thing off to a great start. And the private equity firm had done a lot of that. As I recall, they also, unusual for leadership teams, they were looking pretty good on supportive organizational context, meaning they weren't feeling like they just had no access to training or education or the material resources they needed to do the work. That's some of the kinds of supports that they have been getting from this private equity firm. So they were doing a lot to create solid conditions for these teams. And, and there were just a couple of points of feedback there about where they might help them do even better, like, elevating the level of interdependence and providing some additional team coaching or teaching the leaders how to provide that kind of coaching at the team level. So my curiosity is, so how did the private equity firm take that up because of the patterns in the data that suggested what additional kinds of support these teams would benefit from?
Yeah, that's I think an evolving conversation in terms of where they're going to take it from here. I mean, their response to this process was very positive. They felt like they learned a lot in the process, and it was actually, of all of the companies, when we worked with them, we worked with them not virtually, and the process of engaging with that team. I mean, they were extremely strong team themselves, but the process of coming together to really reflect on how they were doing was very validating, and really sort of on a number of levels for them. And it was really just something that I think gave a lot of energy and positive, momentum and affirmation for their own team, which I think was really a really nice piece of the work as well. Yeah.
So on a nuts and bolts level, each leader had a 90-minute debrief, CEO, and then the team had a 2-hour debrief. The private equity company got a half-day session, I think we did with them. And then you met all the CEOs and you did a couple of hour session where you went over the data. But I think you made it really interactive, and there was, you focused in on interdependence and purpose and team coaching and these things, right? And did some exercises.
That's right.
And now what I understand is this led to is a number of those CEOs now on their own have opted in for some coaching, one-on-one coaching, some for team coaching, right? There's been a lot of, it generated a lot of interesting insights that has led to, the
desire for additional
COVID,
action,
I think, slowed. The COVID hit right after the end of the feedback part of this engagement.
That's right. We finished the last part of it, and that might have been the last flight I took to this meeting. It's true. That it did kind of create some awareness for some of these folks about what more they could be doing to putting their teams on the right course. And so that's resulted in a number of different things, from just selection questions from some teams that are bringing on new members to some individual coaching for leaders as they think about how do they coach their teams, to kind of like team design and team redesign for some teams as well, thinking like, wow, I have way too many people on this team. How do I redesign this so we have actually a team that can be more highly interactive and interdependent, more than what's possible if you have a larger group.
Yeah. The other thing, David, is I think the team we were a part of, I have to say, I think you were an awesome team leader. I think you were extraordinary, just holding us together and keeping us moving along. I think you did a great job of that. I think we also, there were 4 of us who mainly were working on this together, and we paired up, which I think was a good move, so that we could have just divided up the 12 teams or 13 teams, each taking 3, but we decided that it would add more value to work in pairs for the client. So it created more work, but I think that was a real value add, doing it that way. So we had a pair for every company and with the CEOs and with the teams. I think that added a lot of value. We also used like Trello because we weren't co-located, and we had everything organized in a online Kanban board with Trello to manage all the documents. And just, we mapped out the process, right, from scoping out the CEOs and I think that was helpful, just keeping the whole system of 13 teams moving along. So I think we did a couple of things deliberately, and also maybe just trial and error that helped us work effectively as a team. But I have to say that was one of the recent teams that I've been a part of that I really enjoyed. And I'm always struck by when a team has a really clear purpose, clear task, and the time frame is not too long. There's something about that to me really helps set teams up for success. And I think this was like a 4-month project or something, but we kept focused as a group and drove through, in addition to some good coaching from you as a team leader, David. So,
well, thanks for that, Christopher. It was definitely, I have to say, it was a really enjoyable experience. I mean, for someone who does, probably a fair amount of work, either solo or, with one other person or two, to be a part of a team that was behaving in this really interdependent way, was really fun and generated a lot of energy and enthusiasm and I felt so grateful and supported that I had such competent, capable people who were, able to, share the work and the reward as well. So that was really, just kind of, it really brought home to me just how enriching being part of teams can be. So that's a nice thing to think about in our work too. We can not only make teams more effective in terms of their output, but we can also increase kind of quality of life in a sense. Yes. Right? By making the hours of our day more enjoyable as we do the things that we're doing in the world.
I personally think, and I think we have some data, maybe we'll have some other cases coming up, that a lot of our challenges around employee engagement being low in companies and organizations has been because we've been organizing work around individuals and not in the group or the team level so much. And I think when you're part of a team, it meets a lot of needs for belonging and identity, focus, purpose. It gives you something else, and I think for me, that's what, when you were speaking, was that's what was surfacing in me.
I think I was having a related reaction, which is imagining all of the listeners to what you just said, David, about the enrichment of being in teams, thinking about all of their incredibly frustrating experiences being in teams. There are a lot of teams in name only in organizations where you're obliged to be part of them and they have meetings, but that is not the group with whom you are truly interdependent to do meaningful accomplishment towards some shared purpose. So there are a lot of things out there that create experiences that are not like the experience that we had in this particular team. And so I think it's important to remember that getting the design right is actually what creates that sort of joyous and learning filled and supported experience for people working in teams.
Yeah, that's right. That's a right on point. Absolutely.
There's a lesson here for me around not just what like 6 conditions and team practitioners can bring to private equity companies and startups and investments, but going the other way, I think there's some learnings around the power of having stakeholders really involved and supporting the design and launching of teams and having that contextual support. I don't think we should underestimate the power of that. And I think the 6 conditions practitioners, or just team effectiveness practitioners in general, could do a bit more to bring these key stakeholders into the front end of these teams and enroll them a lot more than I think we naturally do. I think we talk about customers and stakeholders. I think they're a little bit still probably too much in the background. And I think this is a good example of the rigor that private equity companies bring, because they're putting their money on the line. They're not just going to inject money and hope for the best. Like, they actually want to ensure that those teams are going to win and succeed, right? So I think there's something we could take from that the other way, right? A two-way street in terms of learnings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, really nice point on that, for sure.
Nice. Well, I think maybe this is a natural place to start to bring this episode down to a close. David, if people want to learn more about you, I think they can find you on LinkedIn. We'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Where else could they discover you? I'm sure just Google searches will generate hits. But
yes, my website's www.tate-consulting.com. And our new book that's coming out in next spring is, again, Conscious Accountability. So, you'll be hearing more about that as we, get closer to rolling that out. So that's I'm happy to hear from folks if they're curious or want to, learn more about anything we talked about.
Yeah. And, we'll have to commission you, David, either us or you together, maybe putting a little case study together of a couple pages. Sometimes we put these little case studies together that capture some of the high level insights from these cases and stuff. So if you're up for that, we may welcome you or invite you to do that with us. We're building.
Absolutely.
We have a handful of these, like, whether they're pre-post cases of teams, but I think just out in the knowledge base out there for practitioners, like, the more we can share these kind of case examples, I think it'll stimulate people to push themselves a little bit further. But again, we can all accelerate each other's growth around this, because I think, tying this back to the beginning of our episode, there's a lot more, it feels like there's a lot more stakes on the line now in terms of our effectiveness. And, and it is about building prosperous, effective companies and organizations, but there are challenges in the world that need us to step up our game. And I think the sharing together across our communities and our, sectors and things just kind of lifts all boats. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Bruce, do you want to say a final word, and then we can give David the last anything he wants to say in closing?
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful pitch that you just made, and I want to agree that this would be a lovely case to share and put it out there beyond our conversation today. It's actually a particularly wonderful illustration of the science and art of building great teams. It's a very data-driven piece of work that was done, and that was a great deal of its value to everybody who was involved. But there were a lot of artful choices that you as an intervention team made, that the private equity firm made, very artful choices about how you shared the data, how you worked with it, how you worked with the chief executives in there and their teams. And so that sort of marriage of science and artful practice, I think, is always just a wonderful illustration to share with people to learn from about how they can improve their own practice.
Yeah, great. That sounds great. I'd be happy to work on that with you both.
Yeah.
Great.
So David, final word for you. Anything you want to say in closing here to button this up, and then we can say goodbye?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the things I've been thinking about lately, is about, I mentioned that the title of our upcoming book is about a conscious accountability. And really, it's a lot about the work that teams are doing. How do we create in teams and organizations and systems kind of the capacity to learn and grow and get better together over time, which is really, in some ways, the spirit of the 6 conditions, right, is in team effectiveness. And so part of the way we've been thinking about that is that, this idea of awareness of interdependence is crucial. Like, to be able to be aware of how my or our actions or inactions impact other people around us, that some of whom we see and some of whom we don't see, is an important kind of awareness for leaders to really kind of cultivate in themselves intentionally. And that awareness, developing that awareness is really, life's work in a way. Or there's an invitation there that if we can continue to work in building our awareness, both of ourselves, of other people, and of systems and larger, kind of more macro level dynamics, that's the way, we're going to eventually, have a leg up on solving some of the challenges in the world that we see. And I'll close with a quote from Rumi, which captures, I think, this idea of multiple levels of awareness. Rumi wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." So I'll let you sort of I'll leave it with that in terms of just something to muse about.
Very artful way of ending our episode today, David. Thank you so much. Great stuff. And listeners, I'm sure you got a lot of great value out of today's episodes, and we're looking forward to seeing you in the next one. So stay tuned. We'll see you guys next time on the 6 Conditions podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and have a great day wherever you are.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For show notes, links to great resources mentioned in the podcast, and for more information, go to 6teamconditions.com. See you next time on the 6 Conditions podcast.